When I began to work on empathy, it began to unlock a lot of leadership lids in my life.
I'm rolling now.
What's going on, Stay the Course podcast listeners? Sometimes when you put your vision out there, it may seem crazy. Hey, I'm excited because I get to sit face to face with my guests, and now you guys get to see me.
Beautiful.
I know we have some incredible interviews and guests that you don't want to miss out on. Welcome back to another episode of the Stay the Course podcast. I'm your host, Jimmie Johnson. This show is a podcast where we meet some of the most influential thought leaders around the globe and hear their stories. My hope is that you're inspired, uplifted, and motivated to fulfill your God-given purpose and make a difference on this earth. If you're tuning into the podcast for the first time, be sure to subscribe to my mailing list to receive weekly encouraging blog posts and be the first to know about the latest episodes. And stay tuned as I'm getting ready to release my podcasting e-course. So many of you have asked me, how do you launch a podcast? Well, in this course, I'm going to show you how to launch a podcast from start to finish. And so if that's something of interest to you, maybe to help leverage your business or nonprofit or even maybe you have a book coming out. Some people do it for that as well. This is the course for you. So I'll be sharing more information about that in upcoming podcast episodes. But today I'm excited to be sitting down with someone I believe is a hidden gem in the church world. He serves as the executive of ministries at Christ Fellowship Church in South Florida. It's a multi-site congregation with more than 30,000 members in weekly attendance across 16 campuses. And when he's not managing day-to-day operations of the church, James can be found spending time with his wife, Lisa, of 27 years. Love that. And the youngest of his 3 kids. He loves to cycle and dive into new books. So let's welcome James Duvall to the Stay the Course podcast.
Hey, man. So good to be with you, Jimmy. Thanks for having me on the show.
Man, it's awesome to have you on here. And before we jump into this episode today, I just want to share how I first came to know you. A couple of months ago, I went to Christ Fellowship's conference. It's a conference for church leaders. And at that conference, I signed up for a breakout session. And it was a breakout session for Dr. John C. Maxwell, who's a phenomenal leadership coach who also lives here in Palm Beach, Florida. And also is a teaching pastor at your church as well. Yeah. And, I was like, okay, I'm going to Dr. Maxwell's, leadership talk. This is going to be awesome. I get in the room. It's 5 minutes till. I believe there's 2 seats sitting on the stage, and then you step on stage. And I was like, okay, that's not Dr. John C. Maxwell. He looks different these days. And then, I was like, okay, maybe he's interviewing Dr. John C. Maxwell. And then surely enough, you say, hey, I'm not Dr. John C. Maxwell. I'm James Duvall, and I'll be, sharing with you guys today. Yeah. And I love that because, so many times we go into things, with small thinking or a small mindset in the sense that, okay, I wanted to receive from this particular person, but we always have to be open and willing to allow other people to speak into our lives. And I really walked away from that talk encouraged, inspired. And that's afterwards, awesome. I actually went up to the stage and talked with you and exchanged information with you. And I'm glad I did. And that's what leads us to this podcast episode. So yeah. I just want to say thank you for, sharing the message that you shared. And I knew when I heard you speak, I was like, I want to get to know James Duvall. That's awesome. I think me and him could be friends.
Well, just a little backstory on that, because I still get kind of harassed about that breakout from friends on staff, was we actually had to do a description for each breakout. And I actually quoted Dr. Maxwell in my description. It actually never said he was teaching. It just was a quote from him. And I didn't realize it until the breakout filled up so fast, and it was kind of standing room only. It's a big room, like 300 some people in the room. And the day before, I realized that I think people think Dr. Maxwell is going to teach this breakout. And so the only thing I could do is like, hey, I'm not John, but I'm James, and I'm your friend, and kind of give my best shot. But it was an awesome opportunity. It was great to meet you there as well, and glad you got something out of it.
Well, you see, if I ever have to speak at a conference, I'm going to quote someone that I think will bring lots of people into the room.
Yeah.
I think that was very strategic. So maybe next year, just try it again. I'll still come to your talk, whether it's John C. Maxwell or not.
Yeah, I appreciate that, man.
Well, let's get started on the podcast today. One of the things I love most about the podcast is really digging into people's journeys and their career. And what's unique about yours is that you've actually stayed put, you've stayed the course at one particular job for a very long time. You've been on Christ Fellowship staff for more than 2 decades.
Mm-hmm.
And that's unheard of in today's society. That's really admirable because, a lot of people, they're transitioning constantly, And so my question is twofold for you. Was Christ Fellowship your first job out of college? And if so, what was your role when you first started in ministry?
Yeah, it wasn't my first job out of college. I actually was at a couple other smaller churches before coming to Christ Fellowship, and I was actually a youth pastor. My background was kind of in music, and then I transitioned. I started working with the inner city youth ministry when I was in college, and fell in love with students, and so that was kind of my start in ministry in the church world, was actually working with students. And I became familiar with Christ Fellowship. I was traveling the country doing music at camps, and met Pastor Tom and Pastor Todd at that camp, and that was back in 1995. And in
Wow.
1996, my wife and I moved here with our 1-year-old daughter at the time. And so that was kind of how we ended up here. Is kind of a crazy journey how we got here, but it was pretty cool.
And so being that you've been at Christ Fellowship for 2 decades, I can only imagine that, like you said, you started off in one particular position, and now you're operating in a capacity that you oversee, much of the operations of the church, which is a huge responsibility. Me having been an operations director, know the responsibility that, you hold. And I know it can be tough trying to prioritize family time and the responsibilities that you have outside of the church. So for someone who's a husband, someone who's a father, I want to pick your brain about this particular topic of, having that balance. So I want to know, how have you managed, balancing that over the years?
Yeah, I think I've gotten better over time with it. When Lisa and I first got married, we were really young. First of all, we got married when we were 21. Actually, Lisa turned 22 on our honeymoon, and today that still is kind of a hard thing because I have to celebrate our birthday and our honeymoon in the same week, our anniversary in the same week. But so we really didn't. I mean, we kind of tease about when we teach on marriage is that, back when we got married, we didn't really even have that much premarital counseling. Like our pastors, like 30 minutes, asked us a few questions like, hey, you guys are good to go. And so we really know that was kind of the grace of God in our life that has allowed us to sustain and have a thriving marriage. But, when we kind of talked, because we were young when we got married, that we kind of grew up with our first child, Alex, who's now 24 years old. And, so there was, I don't know there was anything strategic that we did to, kind of keep our relationship thriving. I think some of it was just that we worked it out. And, when we were having a conversation just recently with a young couple, and I think intuitively we did this, we didn't know it though. It's like, when you come into a marriage, both the husband and wife kind of bring baggage from their past into a relationship. And sometimes couples will kind of hold on to their own baggage, or if I bring baggage into the marriage, maybe Lisa wouldn't pick up my bags. But, I think intuitively what we did is when we came into marriage, we both unpacked our individual baggage and kind of packed it into a new suitcase that became our marriage relationship. And so, again, we actually never went to any marriage conferences or anything when we were younger. We just kind of worked it out, and it really is a grace of God. But I think with just kind of the balance side of work and family, when we came to Christ Fellowship in 96, our daughter Alex was just 1. And so we were in a season when we could kind of move pretty quick, and the pace of the church was pretty high. The church at the time was about 1,500 people. It was the largest church that we'd ever seen or ever been a part of. But we were able to, pick up our daughter and kind of go wherever as she got older and our son Parker came along, it became a little bit more challenging to kind of manage that. And I think one of the pivotal conversations that Lisa and I had early on when I was young in leadership was that I wasn't really that productive as an employee early on. I mean, I had a lot of natural talents and abilities in leadership, but didn't really manage my time well. And so I remember one time she actually came to the church, and I was in the office area with a couple of the other guys, and we were just kind of joking, laughing, having a good time. And she had a real kind of pointed conversation with me, and she's like, "Hey, when you're at work, I want you to work because I want you to be home with me and the kids when you're not." And so that was kind of a pivotal kind of turning for me, kind of going, okay, I need to make sure that I keep the priority of my time, that my family is always prioritized over my vocation. And so I think that's kind of just been the journey that I've been on, and it's probably accelerated even more in the last, probably 9 to 10 years of leadership.
And I think when I was in a marriage session with you and your wife, Lisa, she said that she didn't always work in the ministry. So, earlier on in your career, you were working solely in the ministry. She was not. So she was, I would think, was she staying at home caring for the kids?
Yeah.
And so she was basically saying, hey, do the work, come home, you have a family.
Yeah.
And so I remember one day, when I was working, my wife, I was at the office, and she said, okay, what time are you coming home? And I was like, I don't know. I'm still, doing blah, blah, blah. She's like, hey, your ministry starts at home.
Yeah.
Your ministry starts at home.
That's true.
So do what you need to do there, but remember, your ministry starts at home.
Yeah.
And so I'll never forget that moment as long as I live. And I think you kind of described the same thing. Your ministry starts at home, and make sure that you, not necessarily don't put the church first, but at the same time, you have to make sure that you're caring for and nurturing your relationships with your kids and your wife.
Yeah, I think for Lisa, even though she wasn't working full time, she was very engaged in serving. And I think part of my really kind of honing in how to manage my time and priorities was also, as a husband, to champion the things that were in her, the desires and dreams that she has. And if I was consuming my time with what I did, I couldn't make space for her to kind of lean into some of those dreams and aspirations that she has. Well, so I think, marriage is it really takes two people fully committed, and it's, it's not two people, it's your one life. And so how you manage that becomes more important and also challenging at the same through marriage.
So good. So good. Prior to this interview, I asked you this question: if you were operating in your purpose, and obviously you said yes, but in the response you mentioned this, and I'll read it in quotes. You said, but you have to have this readiness to pivot toward what is most effective in the season of life. Can you expound upon that?
Yeah, I think, right now what everybody's going through, with this pandemic and, coronavirus, I think everybody to an extent has to be ready to be flexible and change. And I think, some people maybe haven't been as prepared to pivot or to be flexible, but I think there's seasons in life and seasons in leadership where you maybe don't get to focus completely on the things that you're passionate about. And I think that's probably what I mean by that is, my kind of personal purpose and how I kind of live my life is three things. It starts with leading myself intentionally. Like I'm very intentional about how I lead myself, and then, shepherding my family, diligently. That's the third thing. Second thing. And then the third thing is, I want to resource leaders effectively. And so, um, when I'm kind of living in that 70-30 range, like 70% of the time, I'm able to kind of um, really invest in those things that I'm passionate about and that I'm good at and natural at, then I have the energy to do the 30%. I'm maybe not, but sometimes in seasons like this, you're forced into maybe doing things that maybe are not as natural in your gifting or natural in your passions, or maybe align completely with, um, you know, maybe what you feel like you're put on the earth to do. But I think all of us have those seasons, and I think it's always that, it's never going to be a balance of 50-50 or 100% doing what you're completely called to do. There's always going to be that sweet spot of being able to operate enough in your calling, your purpose, the things that are wired inside of you, that you can still have the energy and focus to kind of pivot towards things that for a season that maybe not be as natural or as energizing to you.
This could be a yes or no response, and if you want to elaborate on it, you can. I would admit that many of us are married to the lane in which we're operating in and are not willing to pivot, right?
Yeah.
Do you believe that puts a lid on their leadership ability?
Yeah, I think it does. I just finished reading a book by Samuel Chan. It's called The Sequence to Success. And it's a really great book if you're a reader. It's a really short read, but he talks about the sequence of basically of success for people, and it's basically three words. It's observation, opinion, and then opportunity. And so people are always observing us. They're always watching us. They're always seeing how we're reacting, how we're responding, how we're leading, and then they're making an opinion based on their observation. And then based on that, there's going to be opportunities. So if somebody is so dogmatic and stuck in their lane or married to their role of what they do, and are not able to be flexible in times, especially in times of crisis or times when, that's necessary for the organization, necessary for the business, necessary for the family to, make some shifts, that's going to be observed. And, everything in leadership rises and falls on influence. And so people they're going to observe it, they're going to make an opinion, and then they're going to choose whether they're going to give you more influence in their life or the organization or leadership, or they're going to kind of withhold that. So I do think, I'm sorry, you said it was a yes or no answer. I'm having a hard time. I just realized I'm talking, but yeah.
No, you're good. You're good.
I do think that, if you get too married to the method or too married to the medium of how you lead, it can really be a lid on your leadership. And that's why you always have to be, leveling up your skills, leveling up your knowledge, your abilities, and constantly growing.
Love that. In 2012, about 8 years ago, you had a leadership crisis, you say. What happened, and what did you learn from that experience?
Yeah. My wife and I call it my leadership blow up or my ministry blow up. And basically what happened was, in my 30s, early 30s, I went pretty quickly from an individual contributor. I was one person on the team kind of doing a thing, to managing a team, to within a short period of time, overseeing kind of a whole department, being an executive pastor at a very large church. And what happened in hindsight was my ability to lead, or my the leadership character, and really what it came down to was just emotional intelligence, hadn't kind of moved at the pace of my leadership responsibility. And so at the end of 2012, a good friend of mine who was on my team came to me, and he at the end of a meeting, he handed me his resignation letter, and he said, "Hey, we're moving, and I'm stepping off team." Well, it kind of shell shocked me, because I I really hadn't seen any signs of it, or didn't know it was going to happen. And then within a matter of a few months, there were 3 or 4 other members of my team, some of them direct reports, that actually went to our HR director and basically said that they couldn't work for me. I was heavy-handed. I didn't care about them. I was unloving, and I was shell-shocked. I didn't have any. I mean, I didn't know how to respond to it because I didn't see that in me, and
His self-awareness wasn't there.
it just wasn't there. It wasn't there. And I think I've always had a lot of natural leadership abilities, and just the way I'm wired, I can organize things pretty quickly and scale things, but I just didn't have the self-awareness to see it. And so through the first part of 2013, I was just kind of numb. And honestly, looking back on it, was at that season that's kind of propelled me to where I am in leadership today. But I sat down with each one of the team members that would sit down with me. There was one who wouldn't. And I just apologized. I said, "Hey, I want to be better. Help me see what I don't see." And to this day, I have great relationships with all those people. But in 2013, I was introduced to a tool called EQI 2.0, which measures emotional intelligence, and the results came back, and I was just like, "Oh, well, there it is." So it measures 15 skills that are developed, that you can develop in emotional intelligence. And the one I was actually not leveraging very well, actually not leveraging at all, was empathy. It wasn't that I didn't have empathy, I just didn't leverage it. And the one I was over leveraging was assertiveness. And so I would walk into a room in my leadership role capacity and be very direct, feeling like I was very clear, and not being able to read the room. And I tease, like, I think when I left the room, there were people, huddled in the corner crying and, consoling each other. I was just like a bull in a china shop. And when I realized that became kind of the catalyst for me, and I just recently wrote about this, it was kind of a keystone moment for me, that when I began to work on empathy, it began to unlock a lot of leadership lids in my life. And it was just a blind spot. And I had quite a few other blind spots. I mean, there were inhibitions, that self-limiting beliefs that had held me back from my growth in leadership. And come to the end of 2013, I just decided that I was going to go on this relentless pursuit of developing myself as a leader. I think up to that point, I had felt like, hey, I'm in the great leadership culture. John Maxwell is on our team. Dr. Tom Mullins, our founding pastor, is a great leader. And so I just felt like I was going to continue to develop by osmosis. If I'm around leaders, then I'm going to grow as a leader. I just found out that wasn't the case. And so, I started on this relentless pursuit of self-leadership and development, and it's not stopped since that day. And it's still, something I'm very passionate about, today. But it was a hard season, but at the time it was very hurtful, but now I'm very thankful for it. I look back on it as a catalyst that God used in my life to kind of propel me in my leadership.
I think that was good, on the aftermath of it, good by you to realize that, okay, this is the reality. And okay, what am I going to do to fix it? I can continue to go down that trail. And if I do, clearly that's not going to work or serve people well.
Yeah.
So how can I best, position myself to come out of this better than, I started? And so what is your Enneagram number?
What would you think it is?
An 8?
Yeah, I'm an 8 with a 7 wing.
We're the same number. I knew that.
Yeah. Well, the interesting thing is, like, I didn't know about Enneagram at the time. My wife is actually a certified Enneagram coach. And so we've kind of really dove heavy into it the last couple of years. But before I was introduced to Enneagram, I didn't know about it. But for about three years, I had very intentionally worked on empathy, developing that skill. And, as an 8, that 8s are naturally we don't leverage empathy very well. And
Yeah.
so when people who didn't know me very well would have a conversation with me, and I'd say I'm an 8, and they're like, "Oh, you're like a pretty soft 8." And I think what I was doing is I was basically just maturing as an 8 because I was growing in my empathy and uh, in that side of it. So yeah.
And for those listeners who may not know what an Enneagram is basically this test that you can take, and it kind of tells you like your personality traits, and there's different wings, and I'm an 8 because I'm just like James, very assertive, very kind of straightforward, and sometimes not aware of to be empathetic to people, and it's something that can be learned, and it's good for you to take the test. And I didn't take the test, but I've been evaluated by some of my
Self-diagnosed.
coworkers, self-diagnosed, or not even self-diagnosed. I have some coworkers who told me I was a Enneagram 8, and I refused to take the test only just to mess with them, but I knew I was an 8 as well.
Well, I would
But
encourage you that don't go on their assessment, because you're actually not supposed to assess people, but people do all
yeah,
the time. But I will tell you that it's a tool of empathy, and so when you understand the deep motivations that people have inside of them, that really what Enneagram kind of reveals is motivations. My an 8's natural motivation is a challenge, and so I challenge everything, even if what I'm challenging I know is true and right. There's just something in me that just wants to push back on it and so forth, and so when you know put low empathy in that, you can see how it can look like somebody's heavy-handed or
a
doesn't
monster.
care.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah,
So, love that you gave a little bit more insight into that. I didn't really know. I mean, I know about Enneagram, but I knew you could explain it much better than me. That's why I have you on the
yeah.
podcast. Um, but since the conference, I mentioned earlier in the show that I've been following you on social media. And so I follow you on Instagram. I actually, I think I've subscribed to your email list. If I haven't, I'll do that today. But
Okay, thanks.
he shares a lot of great leadership, insight. And one thing that you wrote in your blog post recently, and you kind of mentioned it a little bit earlier in the podcast, was the rock lock, finding
Mm-hmm.
the hidden keystone.
Yeah.
Can we talk through this? Because I honestly think this will help a lot of people. It really did help me,
Yeah.
and I shared it with a couple of friends as well. So just
Yeah.
share what you.
Well, it was just kind of this interesting like aha moment. In my blog post, I share that I love reality TV shows, specifically things on Discovery Channel. So like anything that's about finding treasure or finding gold or anything, like I'm all about that. And so Gold Rush series is like one of my favorite shows, and they have this show that's called Gold Rush Whitewater. And so this father and son, short story, they dive under these waterfalls in Alaska, on this raging river, and it's called a plunge pool. And at the bottom of the plunge pool, the gold will settle to the bottom, to bedrock. And so they'll go in with these suction dredges and dredge out all the rocks and the dirt and so forth, so they get down to bedrock to where the gold is. And I was watching this episode, and they talked about that this guy was down and he could not move the rocks, and they started explaining this concept of rock lock. And so I was like, oh, this is interesting. And it was like this aha moment that that people, leaders, I think even anybody, but I'm in the leadership, I think leaders experience rock lock and don't know what it is. And so basically the idea is that these rocks are, they come over the waterfall and it just pounded down by the water, and they get locked into place in such a way that you can't move them. And so what the diver has to do is he has to find one rock that will unlock all the other rocks, and it's called the Keystone Rock. And
Wow.
when you find that rock and you unlock it, then you can begin to move the other boulders. And so if I go back to my story, for me, the keystone was empathy. When
Yeah.
I found that I was under leveraging that skill, and I started working on it, it raised all my emotional intelligence and my interaction with people, my communication, my dynamics, and how I lead teams and so forth. And so that became the keystone. For some people, the keystone may be a self-limiting belief. You may have something that's an inhibition that is keeping you from moving forward, and you got to find what that is. And once you find that keystone and move that, then all the other stuff's still there. Like all the other leadership issues, blind spots I had were still there, but it allowed me to get momentum to start moving some of those rocks out of the way to continue the analogy, to get down to bedrock where the real gold and the leadership potential and influence really is. And so I think it was a big aha for me, because it's like, oh, that's what I did. And now I'm still in this ongoing process of moving rocks, because if you carry out the analogy, the river is constantly carrying stuff down, and the waterfall's still there, and it's still pouring over into our life. And so if we're not constantly growing, constantly, as Stephen Covey says, sharpening the saw, if we're not continually doing that, then we have the potential for to get locked up again. And so that's the analogy. As I've been sharing it and looking for context, now I can't, I've Googled it, I looked for it, and it's just one of these aha moments that, I feel like God dropped in my lap from watching Gold Rush. And see, there is benefit in watching TV. And it's just been something I've been processing and trying to figure out how to structure the way more and more that people. So the blog post I wrote was just kind of the first kind of attempt of like, what does this look like, and how can people apply this to their life?
And I think when you use things that in spaces people are already in, so like, most times people are just like, all right, here's the leadership stuff that I'm going to share with you. And it's just like, that's kind of boring.
Yeah.
But if you kind of bring in some things that, people, can use,
Yeah.
like a reality TV show, like I would have never been able to take a reality TV show and apply it to leadership, but the way you did it was just so good. So if you're interested in reading James's blog post, the title of that particular blog is Rock Lock, Finding the Hidden Keystone. Yeah. And it's on his website, and we'll give you his website towards the end of the podcast. But hey, James, in 2019, you read more than 50 books, 50 books in 2019. What I love most about, you reading that many books and you accomplishing this feat is that you weren't always an avid reader.
No, I wasn't.
When did that change? And how do you go about creating healthy habits that play into you reading?
Yeah, that's good. I wasn't a reader at all, actually. And, the statistics on something like the average American reads like one book a year. And so wow. I was probably average at best. Going back to a little bit of my story, I think, when we talk about inhibitions or self-limiting beliefs, nobody was prohibiting me from reading. Actually, I was in a culture where, with John Maxwell, we got a new John Maxwell book every time one came out. And, but they just sat on my shelf, and I had some limiting beliefs I think kept me back from reading. First of all, I have dyslexia. And so I've struggled with that all the way through school. And so that was always kind of a crutch for me. I'm a slow reader. I can't retain what I'm reading.
Clearly not when you read 50 books.
Well,
not anymore.
Yeah, but
some of them audible,
honestly,
obviously. But
honestly, what I do is not rocket science. Like the reality is that, and that's why I say if I can read the books I'm reading, anybody can do it. But it all started when I changed my attitude. So at the end of 2013, when I made the decision that I was responsible for my own leadership journey, I couldn't count on anybody else to help me be a better leader. And I really think that's what leadership is. It starts with self-leadership. And I think you're going to look at people who have great influence in culture and politics and government or wherever. A lot of them are very committed to leading themselves first. And so I just said, I'm going to start reading books. And so it was like everybody else. I set a goal. I was like, I'm going to read a book a month. And so I did that. And at the time I listened to a podcast from Michael Hyatt, and he had made a statement. He said, read for expansion, not for retention. And so that was one of my limiting beliefs. It's like, I can't retain anything. He's just like, his thing was like, don't try to retain everything. Just read to expand who you are as a person. So, and he also freed me up. He also freed me up to know that Audible books were actually really books. And so my first year I read 12 books, and most of them were Audible books, and there was nothing rocket science. But the next year I was like, okay, I think I can read 24 books. And so that was so 2014, 2015, I read 24 books, just a standard, 2 books a month. In 2015, I had read a book by Darren Hardy called The Compound Effect.
Love that book.
It's
Mention it on the podcast. If you haven't read it,
yeah,
read it.
it's a foundational book. I read it every year, and basically, he makes the statement, you probably share here, that small smart choices over plus consistency over time equals success. So
Yeah.
small smart choices every day over time equals success. So I thought, man, I wonder what would be if I just started compounding my life. And reading was one of those things I'd started really enjoying reading at that time. So I said, I wonder what would happen if I just read 10 pages a day, and what would that look like? And so I made a commitment that I would read 10 pages a day, every day. And I put books every place. So it wasn't like 10 pages of the same book. It was a cumulative number of pages. And then anytime that I was in the car by myself, or on my bike, or working out, I would listen to an Audible book. And so I did that in 2000, I guess that was 2015, 2016. I read like 36 books. And I was like, oh, okay. And then my reading started getting a little bit quicker. So I raised that to 17 pages. I think I was coming at the end, I was like, what do I get 50 books? And so I raised it to 17 pages and did 50 books. That was 2017, I think. 2018, I read like 96 books, and then 2019, 83 books. So
Wow.
and so that's my discipline. Now with that, I've created some routine around that. So my day starts out reading. So I get up, every morning at 5 a.m. And the first thing I do is I have my quiet time of prayer. I journal a little bit, and then I dive into reading. So for me, I'm probably not going to get my pages in the day unless I do it first thing in the morning. And so I'll read, at least 20 pages. And so now I'm reading 3 books at a time, 3 physical books at a time. And then I have an Audible book that I'm reading. So I'm usually reading 3 to 5 books at a time, any given occasion. But it just really started, what really accelerated it was when I just said, I'm going to stop trying to read books, and I'm going to read pages.
That's so good. And, just break down that big goal to a very, very small thing. So just pages, don't even think about the books. Just start with the pages and then work your way up. And before you know it, you'll be reading like James.
Yeah.
So, hey, we're going to put a bow on this episode of the Stay the Course podcast. But before I let you go, I have some rapid fire questions for you to answer.
Uh-oh.
5 questions really quickly. I think I may know some of these answers, but we'll see. Number 1, Audible, Kindle, or hard copy book?
Hard copy book and hardbound.
Love it. Number 2, fiction or nonfiction book?
Nonfiction.
If you were to write a book about your life, what would be the title?
Oh, that's a tough one. I don't know. Gosh, I thought you said it's rapid fire. I'd have to think.
Not really a rapid fire question, right?
Let me come back to that one. It'd probably be from blow up to breakthrough.
I like that alliteration. That always makes it easier for people to resonate with.
Yeah.
Number 4, love languages or Enneagram? Which one do you like the best?
Enneagram.
Number 5, morning bike ride or afternoon bike ride?
Oh, definitely morning. It's too hot in the afternoons.
James, it was a pleasure having you on the Stay the Course podcast. Love talking with you, and I hope whenever the world opens back up post COVID-19, you can actually get together for some lunch.
That'd be awesome.
Or some coffee. And any upcoming events that you have?
My wife and I are going to be teaching a webinar on May 25th, and on actually switching gears when the world is in park. And so it's going to be talking a lot about just how you stay connected when everything feels like it's kind of stopped. So that's May 25th. We're doing it here at the church, but it's going to be a live webinar, and you can find that information on my bio and my social feeds.
Yeah. So how can people, stay, connected with you? Obviously, they can follow you on social media, share your social media handle and then your website.
Yeah. So all my social and my website are the James Duvall, and it's not egotistical. This other James Duvall had my name, so it's the James Duvall. And my website's thejamesduvall.com, and then Instagram and Facebook and is where I typically post most of my stuff.
Well, thank you so much for being on this show. And to everyone listening or watching this episode of the Stay in the Course podcast, if James' story resonated with you, go ahead and subscribe to my YouTube channel, the Stay in the Course podcast, and also subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, or Spotify. Wherever you listen to podcasts, we're likely there. And I just want to let you know that we're just so grateful for you to tune in and listen and learn and grow in your leadership in other areas as well. Once again, thanks for tuning in to the Stay the Course podcast. Until next time, stay the course.